E ngā mana, e ngā reo, e aku rangatira, tēnā koutou katoa, ko hekarangi te maunga, ko waiapu te awa, ko Ngāti Porou te iwi, ko Carol Hirschfeld aho. Nau mai mā takitaki mai koutou e tēnei te wā a matariki, e te ehorangi e Dawn, tēnā koe. Welcome all to this special University of Auckland Zoom webinar. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us. 4 months ago, Professor Dawn Freshwater became the University of Auckland's 6th Vice-Chancellor and first ever woman to take up the position. Ngenyo, the University magazine, headlined a feature profile on her appointment as Dawn of a New Era, suitably hopeful and welcoming. So what can the university community and the world beyond the campus expect in the months and years to come? I'm very pleased to welcome Vice-Chancellor Dawn Freshwater to this live webinar tonight and have this as an opportunity to talk to her about her vision of the university and also a chance for us all to learn more about the experiences that have led her to this place and this role. A very warm welcome Te Atawai Māori.
Kia ora, Carol.
Dawn, I have a wonderful whanaunga who pointed out what a fabulously optimistic name you have, which prompted that translation.
Thank you.
Now, during our session, we're going to be inviting members of our audience to offer up questions, but I want to begin with my own. So, back in March, on March 16th, you were due to take up your new position here at the university. But within days, the Prime Minister was already announcing the national alert system and hinting that there was going to be a complete lockdown. In terms of an introduction to a new job and a new country, that sounds positively surreal, was it?
It absolutely was, Carol, yes. And I have to say, I think fortunately I had visited the university and knew the university, was a little familiar with New Zealand before I came, but on the day that I arrived, so I arrived the night before I was due to commence my new role. And I knew that we were in this sort of difficult transition through COVID because I'd left a similar situation when I'd left Australia. But very, very keen and delighted to have arrived in Auckland prior to any decisions being made around lockdown or quarantine, and enthusiastically appearing at the campus on the Monday morning, ready to meet with my new team and to commence the work. And of course, immediately that happened, I became aware that one of the first things that we had to do was make a decision about how we were going to prepare for what was by then becoming inevitable, which was a move off campus. And so that was the very first experience I had, which was a bit surreal. New country, new job, new team, and of course not very much opportunity to get to know the environment or the campus at all.
How responsive do you think the university was to the threat of the pandemic? I mean, what did you walk into? Were you pleased with what you saw in terms of the planning?
So I was very fortunate that the university had already put together some thinking around the pandemic. The strategic response team were already meeting and had already begun to do some of this work, and that had begun quite early, so January, February, thinking particularly about students who were offshore and how to manage that particular issue, but more broadly going forward how we would manage if COVID became embedded within the community. So that team were already meeting, and I have to say, for institutions that are so large and often referred to as slow to move, monolithic is sometimes the way they're described, the university was really becoming exceptionally responsive, agile in the way in which it was reacting to, and as much as possible preparing to give the students the best possible experience and to ensure that our staff were able to function off-site. Some of that was already in place, and then we were able to move really rapidly when we needed to.
We'll talk more about that response and the preparedness shortly, Dawn, but I want to go back to your list of priorities that were actually top of mind as you were coming into this job before COVID-19 overrode everything. What were your considerations?
So 3 things. The first thing, I knew that the university was due to develop and iterate a new strategy. Very exciting, really great opportunities in that regard, particularly given the situation we're in geopolitically and where we're situated, Aotearoa and the Pacific communities and what could be done in the oceanic region. And so very excited to work with the university community on a new strategy and clarify our purpose in a changing environment globally where higher education has really been under pressure to transform itself. And secondly, in doing that, to really set the tone and the culture of the university going forward, to make it distinctive. And of course, thirdly, to think of the university as a sustainable institution way beyond my time as Vice-Chancellor. And when I talk about sustainability, I mean in the broadest sense, so not just thinking about immediate financial concerns or indeed campus or maintenance or any of those issues, thinking about its longevity into the future and the legacy that we would leave. So already thinking about my legacy coming in.
As you thought about that legacy, had you had time to actually scope the university at all before you, I imagine you would have, how often had you visited and what did you know of the university?
So I knew the university a little from previous experience of working through World University Networks and international networks, and so I'd had some engagement with the university in that regard. And it's not really a secret now, people do know, but a few years before that I was invited to the University of Auckland to give a lecture and to meet some of the students in the staff in the School of Nursing. Because there's a very strong nursing school here and that was my previous discipline. And so I'd visited many years ago, but I'd never really spent any time or dwelt on the campus. So what I knew was from pretty much an external perspective. And of course we do benchmarking of universities globally, and Auckland was one of the universities that I benchmarked against in the past. So I had some insights and some information, but there's nothing like the feel of the place, Carol, and nothing like really getting yourself immersed. I like to talk about rolling my sleeves up and getting my hands dirty, because that's the way that you really get to know an environment and the people within it.
Your own history stretches Nottingham University, the University of Leeds and the University of Western Australia, where you were immediately before arriving here. Was there a connection, was there a continuum through to Auckland University that in some ways brought you here?
There was, and isn't it interesting on reflection, it's not always easy to see those connections at the time as they unfold. And on reflection, they're much more explicit. So University of Nottingham, University of Leeds, both Russell Group universities, world-class institutions, research-intensive institutions, very much committed to translating research into improving lives for people in the community, and global universities. And Leeds, of course, very much connected through the World University Networks to the University of Western Australia, another research-intensive university, member of the Group of 8, and another university that was really committed not only to improving lives through its research, but addressing issues that were related to the Indigenous population and to ensuring that we were really reflective of our communities in all shapes and sizes. And that was a really tough job to do because we were nowhere near that. And then of course coming to the University of Auckland, a research intensive university, really embedded as a civic institution, an anchor institution in the city, and part of the same networks that I've come from, and really committed to delivering high quality education and research that informs and is relevant and impactful to its communities here and in the regions. So there is a strong connection actually throughout.
You were at the University of Western Australia for several years before you came here, 2.5 of those years as Vice-Chancellor. What was it about your experience there which you feel has shaped your thinking about going into a multiculturally diverse place such as Auckland?
And that's one of the wonderful things about being in Auckland. It is such a multicultural and diverse environment, and with a wonderful tradition and heritage and so many opportunities to really build on that. And that was one of the things I learned about being in Western Australia. And in fact, I should say, being in a city like Nottingham and Leeds, very multicultural cities, diverse environments, diverse student bodies. So, you know, that is another part of what's very attractive about being in Auckland. I think I learned, and this goes to your question about, you know, what shaped my thinking. It's really important, I think, through those lessons learned in those environments before I got here, to understand, take time to understand where I'm situated, how I've landed, where I am, the context, the environment, and to listen and to actively listen and to think about that in a way that helps us to consider how to do something distinctive and unique with our strategy. And in doing so, lifting all boats and doing something that's really in the service of the nation. And what I've found through my experience is each of those institutions, albeit diverse and albeit multicultural, inclusive in different ways, has something unique to offer and is distinctive in and of its own right. And that's really the essence of what we're going to put right at the heart of our new strategy.
Dawn, I'm going to take this minute to remind our audience that we are indeed taking questions, and would love to hear what you're thinking about the conversation and some of the things that Dawn is talking to. You can use the Q&A function on Zoom to submit your questions, and of course upvote questions by using the thumbs up icon. So Dawn, I suppose you know, it's wonderful to hear your fulsome excitement about the diversity that you have enjoyed at the different places that you have already served at, and certainly at Auckland it is a central function of the university. Did you feel equipped as in every way to take on that challenge of coming into a place that is so multicultural and diverse?
Absolutely not. And I say that in this context, we are all experts as we grow through our life in some things. And I have developed expertise in many areas, but we are simultaneously novices in many other areas of our lives. And hopefully, as we grow through novice to advanced beginner and proficient, we're learning, and we learn some expertise along the way. But the reality is, as an expert in some areas, I have some transferable skills. And that means that as I learn, as a novice in Aotearoa and in Auckland, and learning about the Māori culture and what it means to be situated here, I have some transferable skills from the expertise I've developed in other situations. So, you know, hopefully I sort of am able to bring those transferable skills and use them in the service of that learning, scaling up my learning as quickly as possible. But of course, every context is different. And if I'd assumed that I had all the skills already and had the knowledge that I needed, then I would really be doing both myself, the university and the communities a disservice. Missed opportunities to learn and a missed opportunity to be engaged in really expanding myself.
One area of real expertise that you do have is around reducing inequity in education and opportunity around education. What do you see as the real area for development here in Auckland?
Well, it's clear that we have a lot to do, both in terms of, if I think about the university first, in terms of both our students and our staff cohorts. And I think this is one of the things that we're looking at now in the new strategy. we really need to think about our university communities and our staff particularly as representing and representative of our broader communities. We get such a diversity of thought, diversity of solutions, and a diversity of thinking in terms of creativity if we do that. So there's a significant piece of work that needs to happen in that regard. But I particularly want to go to the school's engagement strategy. I think my experience is a lot of what we need to do is start very young with schools when we're thinking about diversity and equity. We need to start making sure that we approach the environments that we're talking about, school environments and perhaps even early learning, with the sort of approaches in mind that are helping people to think about long-term, their planning, having some opportunities ahead of them, but not particularly thinking about what it is that we would want in that regard, helping people to realise their imaginations and their inspirations and their ambitions. To do that, we have to understand what they are, and actually they have to understand what they are quite early as well. So from us, I think we've got quite a bit of work to do in our schools' engagement as well. And I think the other part of what we ought to be doing at the university, we've got great relationships with the city already, and great relationships with iwi and hapu. We need to continue to build on those.
When you consider the university's performance over the past 4 months and just returning now to the response to the pandemic, what do you think the biggest lesson has been so far?
So there are many lessons in all of this, and it's actually, I feel really thrilled when I look back and see what's happened over the last 3 or 4 months, and how we've responded in particular. So I really want to call out the way in which we were able to move to online delivery very quickly and maintain the quality and the engagement of our students, and actually to manage some of the pastoral care in a very different way. So that's something that really I think we need to celebrate. The other thing that I think is really important, an important lesson here, and I mentioned this when I was meeting with ministers and the Prime Minister recently, what's happened through COVID is there's been a rehabilitation of evidence and a development of trust again in evidence and a trust in the expert that was really diminishing over time. And I think what I've seen, particularly through the development of the evidence base that's been used to support COVID's outcomes and to support the way in which we've managed it, is that people have been relying on the research, on the evidence, and using that to inform decisions.
In terms of online learning, you mentioned this earlier, that one of your first acts was to actually basically get everybody in the mode of thinking of remote learning. And the university basically closed fairly early in terms of closing classes and just getting people at home. So why did you take that action?
Well, immediately on arrival, it seemed to me that we were going to have only a very short amount of time before we were going to need to move off campus and go into lockdown. And it seemed to me that one of the ways in which we needed to buy ourselves some time so that we could prepare for a longer term delivery of high quality online programs and the experience that we wanted to wrap around that was to say that we would take a week where we would have a teaching free week, and that was the opportunity for staff to really get the mindset of we're going to be moving to online. How can we translate what we already do in a way that it suits this particular modality, and to do that quite rapidly. And so it was a case of saying everything else is off the table for the next week. As it happens, we had 3 days because by Wednesday we were going into lockdown. So, but it was actually really helpful to be able to say, let's give ourselves some time to do this, so that we have a little bit of a lead-in and a run-in to managing this process.
Was there any resistance? I mean, You know, we were laughing about the idea that earlier that, you know, universities are described as monoliths, slow to move, but that wasn't the case here.
It absolutely wasn't. Now, of course, some courses are already offered online and mixed modalities are used, so there's blended learning that takes place. So this isn't completely new to the university, and many staff record their lectures and are engaged in different ways of supporting students. So it's a sort of a big shift to fully online, but not without an understanding of the benefits that brings, and not without some expertise and experience. And there's a great support team helping the academic staff to do this as well. So I didn't actually experience the resistance to that. I think what's really important in all of this is the communication. And if the biggest thing I've learned through this particular crisis, and again it just reaffirms things that have happened in the past where I've had to respond quickly, is even if we don't have any certainty, we really need to communicate that we're not certain and that this is what we're going to do. We're hoping to have it this way, but that we're really only sharing what we know now, and we'll share as much as we know now, but we don't know any more than that. And it's so important to keep communicating with staff and explaining the rationale behind the decisions. And I think from that point of view, even if it's difficult, and it has been difficult, even if it's difficult, with a rational explanation, we can all turn our minds to making it happen.
Have you had a chance to even meet all of your management team in person over the short period that you've actually been here, given the conditions?
So I'm now very familiar with the senior leadership team.
On Zoom?
So I got very familiar with them on Zoom, much more familiar than perhaps I would have done if we weren't on Zoom, because Zoom, of course, brings people into your home, brought people into my home. So that was a really great way of getting to know people without really the frills. Stripped back, I say. We were stripped bare. Now I have had an opportunity to meet many of them and many of the other senior leaders across the university. In fact, today I was in one of the faculties, and I'm doing lots of small mini tours now to get around the campus and to get to know people face to face. What was, I think, very helpful, at least for me, and I think for some of the staff, is that we've moved very quickly to all staff meetings on a regular basis using Zoom. And this at least gave an opportunity for people to have a sense of belonging during this time when we were all so dispersed and unable to really communicate with each other face to face or even meet in small groups. So I think, you know, that actually really led to a sense of community quite early on.
We're only something like 10 days out really from semester 2 dawn, and I wonder, with everything that has happened and now the familiarity with online teaching, is the pivot to online going to be something that's very much permanent in terms of the course and courses offered and the way that the university operates into the future?
So if we just put COVID-19 to one side for a moment, Carol, universities have already been responding to what's happening in mega trends in society. So the development of technology, AI, automation, the digitalisation. Student expectations are changing continuously, and of course employers are looking for something really particular in terms of the graduate outcomes, not least students looking for employability. And we need to respond to employment needs. We also need to make sure that we're able to support our students to have what will be many careers in the future and many opportunities in a very different environment with the future of work. That was already happening. And so we'd already started to make some moves towards providing alternative ways of studying and looking at how we make available our content. Content curation is no longer now just the domain of universities. It's the wraparound and how it's delivered and how it's made real and applied that really matters. And that's done best on campus, in groups, with other people, with the whole experience that goes with that. So from my point of view and from many other people's point of view, we will find ways to have a phygital experience, the physical and the digital experience in our blended way through the benefits of a university campus experience at the same time as offering our students the opportunity to be working through work integrated learning and learning on the job in other ways. So this is what the students are expecting these days, and this is of course what's going to help them to really settle into long-term employment.
So you're going to have students streaming back onto campus very shortly. Did you imagine there might have been a moment where this wouldn't have happened?
Only a very few weeks ago.
Wow.
So we've always been optimistic that we'd be able to get our students back onto campus for semester 2. But a few weeks ago, it was very touch and go. We're starting to think, will we get down into level 3 alert, and what will happen at the level 2 alert? And we've been planning and planning. We've had an excellent team working on this matrix as we started to think about what each level would look like for the students returning. Health and safety being the priority, of course, for staff and students and the community. But beyond that, really wanting to make sure that the experience was all that they'd hoped for and more, and that the staff were also really feeling enthusiastic and committed to being back on campus and engaged with the student cohorts again. And that includes our research students whose field work had been completely demolished through not being able to do that in the COVID lockdown.
Dawn, you've talked in the past about how ambitious you are for universities per se. So did you grow up believing that university would play a critical role in your life?
I had no idea. I don't think when I was younger I really understood what universities did. I was somebody who left school very young through family circumstances
15.
At 15 and did the best I could with my GCSEs at the time. Didn't put a huge amount of effort in because I was distracted and doing other things with my family. But actually, I sort of along the way had very good mentors who saw something in me that I didn't necessarily see in myself, and encouraged me.
What did they see, Dawn?
Well, and I think this is something I still, look at now. I hadn't really ever considered that I might be somebody who was able to be a scholar, to apply that in a way that would really not only help other people's life, but to help other people to grow. But I do, having got the mental health background that I have, I now very much see that I am somebody who's really keen to watch other people achieve their full potential. And that's what some people did for me along the way.
You grew up in provincial England. So what was it like growing up in Nottingham in the 70s? Well,
I was a mining town before mining sort of was destroyed really. But that was similar to the revolutions and evolutions that are happening now in technology. It was a very interesting town to be growing up in. Lace featured heavily in Nottingham, as did many other things in terms of what was happening in the environment. But what I recall about it, very happily actually, is with my family being sort of caught up in a mining community, a community where very down to earth, very grounded, safe to play out on the streets.
Social mobility?
Not very much.
Was that an issue for you?
On reflection, and I've thought about this a lot, I always felt that I wanted to do more, be more, explore more, express more, to expand, and I think that was an issue for me. And certainly, I felt very motivated from a very early age, but all the way through my life, to expand and advance and enhance, and always hungry to learn more.
And you became a caregiver to certainly your mother, who suffered from mental health issues, quite severe ones, at an early age, and looking after 2 younger brothers. What did that experience do to you?
Well, I think if other people would describe me as being born walking,
Right.
I became very responsible very early on, and now I realise that's a very important skill to have, but not necessarily the skills that you would want to have really so young, because in some ways, of course, I lost quite a bit of my early years in terms of the ability to play and to be playful and to be creative in different ways. So it's
parentified?
Yes, and when I think about caregivers, and there are many now, of course, we see this is a real issue, not just for people caring for their parents, but having to care for multiple generations simultaneously, and those people also want to study, and why shouldn't they? So this is, I feel very passionate about that. This was a great opportunity for me coming out of that environment, to also learn about my context and to understand it in a way that helped me to frame it differently.
Nursing, it seems like a choice that came pretty naturally given what was happening in your family background.
Yes, so I learnt to care very early, and it was something I'd always wanted to do. I'd always wanted to be a nurse. And I had to sit the entrance test to get, I'm very proud of this, I should say. I had to sit the entrance test to get into the profession because I had left school at 15.
Right.
So most of the people, in fact every other person in the cohort that I joined, had come through the A-level route, and I sat the entrance test and passed the entrance test to be able to get in, and worked so hard to make sure that I didn't fail anything during that training. It was just so important to me. And even now, I can, it's several decades ago, I still can look back and have the experience, the feeling of going onto the ward the first day, and feeling, that it was just the most magical opportunity.
Do you think what occurred, what happened in your private life made you try harder than others, that drove you? Because I suppose the other part of your background, Dawn, which seems frankly kind of exhausting, is that you became a marathon runner as you got older, which again denotes somebody who is utterly driven. Is that how you would describe yourself?
Yeah, and I think it's fair to say that, and I think it's been in peaks and troughs as well, thankfully. But I think it is fair to say that, and there has been a huge amount from my past that has driven some of those pushing myself to, just to know what would this be like? Am I capable of this? How could this happen? And I've often imagined myself into situations and then thought, what, that could happen. Imagining myself being in the Vice-Chancellor's role at the University of Auckland, and then making it happen. So it's an interesting sort of clash here, because on the one hand I sort of feel this was something that I'd never dreamt was in my reach, but on the other hand I was actually very driven and imagining myself being able to do these sorts of things. So a push-pull there.
So how does that translate into the way you think about making tertiary education more available to people who don't come from traditional backgrounds where education is prized or fostered at home?
Yeah, so obviously I feel really passionate about that, and I feel it's my duty and my responsibility in a leadership role such as the one I have to really work to ensure that as many people as possible have the opportunity to, not just in higher education, but have the opportunity through education to provide themselves with more choices in life. That's one of the biggest things we give people. We give people choices that they perhaps didn't really believe they had or weren't aware were there. And so for me, that's part of, my obligation, if you like, in payback from my own experience, coming through the opportunities I've had. And we do have to take them as well. So it
Right.
cannot just be that somebody else spots them. We do have to take them. And that takes courage. So yes, I'm driven, and it requires courage to take those opportunities and to step outside of our comfort zone and to take the risk of it maybe not being quite what we thought. So all of those things are part of an education, bringing people into tertiary education and helping them to see, no matter what their background is, no matter what their age is actually, this is an opportunity for them, and it's up to them how they use it.
Medicine must have been, and still is, dare I say it, a highly hierarchical profession, with nursing, of course, being female-dominated, certainly in the years that you were going through it. What kinds of changes did you experience during that time, and were they positive ones?
Yes, so it's actually it's very different now. We see in many courses, more than 50% of those courses now, the medical programs, are females going into the medical program. That certainly wasn't the case when I went into nursing in 1980, and there certainly was the nurse-doctor game. It was written about in the literature, and partly that game was as the senior nurse on the ward, knowing the patients very much better often than a lot of the doctors who were in and out and having to move across different parts of the hospital campus, was really trying to help the doctor to see what the patient needed, but as if the doctor had made the decision themselves. And I'm talking here very much a her and a him, which goes back to your question. It was very evident, and it was something that was the lived experience of many of my peers for many years. That has radically changed and continues to change, and it changes the other way too. I'm delighted to see a better gender mix in the nursing profession.
And in the management teams that you're part of these days?
Absolutely. So that's something that I feel is still work in progress. If you look at the top 100 universities in the world, there are very few female vice-chancellors. There'd be few vice-chancellors of colour, and and we could go on in that sort of vein. And as you start to get beneath the top 100 universities, it's different. But when we think about those universities that are research intensive, that are in that status of world class and are really held in high esteem, it becomes very difficult to really think about how we can become more diverse in that regard, because many of those people coming up through the pipeline are coming up through careers from several decades ago or recent decades, coming from that tradition. I have to say it's a privilege and a delight to be the first female Vice-Chancellor of the University of Auckland, but the day we get to the point where we're no longer saying first female, we'll be in a much better position.
Why did you choose to go into management, Dawn? Why did it kind of lure you, and what was it that you wanted to achieve by going into a management role?
Well, actually I didn't choose it. I say that, of course, there is some element of choice. I was very happily being a professor running a research team, working in some really interesting areas of mental health, youth suicide, young offenders, and really quite a difficult end of the wedge. And I was approached about taking up a head of school role, actually, and that was at the University of Leeds. And I said, oh no, I'm not interested in doing that. It would take me away from my research. Anyway, to cut the long story short, I was persuaded to go and meet with the people in Leeds, and I was curious. And so
Which bit made you curious?
I was curious about what it would be like to be able to actually make a difference, not just in terms of my research team or the team that was, but actually to be able to do that at a level which would have more impact and more influence, and perhaps have then a bit more of a ripple effect. So I ended up in the head of school role, and I remember, Carol, the first day sitting in the school as the head of school and really seriously saying to myself, well, okay, I'm a head of school now. What does a head of school do? Which was clearly I had ideas about what the head of school did. I wouldn't have been appointed. But those thoughts, I think, cross people's minds, and we need to be, I think it's quite refreshing to be honest about that. And I learned very quickly what a head of school does. And that was the start of my management career.
So, Dawn, it seems that you, for quite some time, have had to juggle a pretty hefty job. Certainly, even in the beginning, when you were moving into formal education, there were family that you were dealing with, you were studying, and you were working. So how on earth do you fit the life bit in?
Well, I guess as an academic, I would say this, but reading and writing is an absolute pleasure. And so when I was, doing some of the work around the edges of writing up some of my research or writing with the team, there's a huge amount of pleasure in that. And reading, there was a time when it would never have been a novel. That's a little bit more on the table now, but it would never have been a novel. Reading all of those great books written by some of my peers, that was pleasurable. And actually I found that I could, and I didn't always have the right balance. I think I'm better now at understanding that productivity isn't 100% full-on work. It's actually a much better balance than that, and I would try to role model that now to my staff. So I didn't always have the right balance, but I did find that absolutely sticking to my routine of running and having the exercise and using those things as not only coping mechanisms but ways of settling my thoughts, of helping me to clear some space and to declutter were really important, and I made sure that they were actually priority constantly.
You are something of a globe-trotting kind of academic these days, and I'm wondering, is it hard to be the foreigner turning up at different institutions, particularly institutions that are as considerably important culturally as a place like the University of Auckland?
Yes, I think there's a simple answer to that, and I think it's important not to shy away from that. There's always work to be done on the ground, no matter what your track record is, what my track record is, what my history is, both in debunking the myths that come before you, but also a lot of work to do on the ground in terms of really trying to understand the environment, as I said earlier in the interview, from the felt experience, not the theoretical, but the practical experience. But also, of course, there's high expectations. The institution, the University of Auckland, the institutions that I've been part of in the past, really important community institutions and part of the city and part of the environment. And so there's a lot at stake, actually.
Dawn, I'm just going to remind our audience again that we are taking, of course, questions during this Zoom webinar, and you can use the Q&A function on Zoom and also use the upvote to move those questions up the chain as well. I guess when I think about the situation that you find yourself in here in Auckland, everybody is very interested in understanding what your priorities will be in terms of specific objectives. So do you have a list of specific objectives that you talked about your legacy? Can you translate them into something even more concrete for our audience?
So what we're working on at the moment, and I use the we, of course I have some vision, which is one of the reasons that I'm here, in the hope that we're able to achieve that together. But really importantly, I'm working with the university community at the moment in terms of defining those objectives and that strategy. And some of that will require us to really think hard and nail our colours to the mast in some of the areas of research excellence that we already have strengths in, but that we really want to enhance and complement so that we are able to translate that high quality research into value. So examples, of course, we're already really excel in much of what we do in our area of health and medical sciences. Brain research is one of those. If we think about what we're doing in terms of the in biomedical engineering, there's work that we can do to bring together what I believe and what many of my colleagues believe, and in fact previously has been discussed as part of the university's thinking going forward, a life science innovation precinct based here in Auckland, medtech being a significant part of that. There are other things that we really need to pay attention to. We are number one in the Sustainable Development Goals, and that's for the second year running in the Times Higher Education rankings. We didn't earn that for nothing. We have excellent opportunities to enhance our agriculture, aquaculture, and particularly agri-tech, and of course that's important to the nation. And thinking about the ways in which we look at not just climate change, but water being very topical, and marine science is one of the areas that we also are really world class in, and they're just some of the things that we're looking at the moment. But all of those with a view to thinking about their grand challenges for the globe right now, whether it's energy, whether it's food security and agriculture, whether it's water, grand challenges. What are the specific issues, the particular issues that we can bring to bear in terms of helping to think those problems and bring solutions, innovative solutions to our communities here and in the Pacific, and then guide the rest of the globe in terms of the ways in which we contribute to those.
That is a significant slate of work.
Of course.
that you're outlining. So we've got at least a half year of academic year to run. What will be the focus of your priorities over the next half year? So
we really do need to focus on business recovery running alongside the strategy. And those two things are running in tandem at the moment. So immediately, of course, it's about the students coming back to the campus in a short time, as you've indicated, and really making sure that we rebuild that community on the campus, and to ensure that the student experience and the learning and teaching, which is a significant part of that, but the student experience is paramount. We of course need to think about how we're going to manage our way beyond the end of this year in terms of recovery of market shares that we've lost internationally as a result of some of the changes that we've had to go through at the border, and actually understanding what it is that we need to provide to our the upskilling in the businesses in the community here, and ensuring that people are prepared for other careers, given that we are likely to see a downturn in the economy as a result of recent events, and of course that has an impact on employment security. So there are a number of things that we're doing already around providing upskilling opportunities, micro-credentials, ways in which we could create bridges for people to move careers very quickly, and we'll expect to see an uptick in the terms of our postgraduate student numbers coming in from people who are really wanting to shift careers post-COVID. So all of those things are on the table. They need to be thought about strategically so we can provide some long-term planning around them.
Dawn, I'm conscious of a number of people submitting questions, as I've been asking them to tonight, and so I'd like to take this opportunity to now turn our attention to some of those questions before we run out of time. So I'm going to take our first one, and it is a question that relates in some ways to what you are talking about. It goes, recently Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern encouraged New Zealanders experiencing pandemic-related unemployment to consider further education. For many, this is easier said than done. Universities generally pitch their e-services and learning programs to the tech-savvy youthful student. However, there may now be more mature students seeking a second chance to study. If this is the case, what changes can be made at the University of Auckland to cater for these more mature students? So indeed, it segues quite well off what you were just talking about.
And in fact, I've had the opportunity to meet the Prime Minister recently in Wellington, and she asked me this question, a very similar question to how do we make universities more attractive to mature students? And I would say, you know, we have to think about this in the context now of multiple generations in employment, in workplaces, and multiple generations in universities.
You've talked cradle to grave approach to education.
That's right. And so we have to be attractive to a whole range, a whole continuum of people who are wanting to perhaps dip their toes in, and other people who are perhaps looking for something more long term. Universities are not necessarily, and particularly research intensive universities, such as the University of Auckland, but it's not just peculiar to the University of Auckland, we're not always seen as particularly porous institutions to mature students. And I think this is not just about marketing, and it isn't just about the pitch. It is also about us really doing some work on helping people to understand what we can offer and how they can engage with us in ways that really suit them and their lifestyle and the other sort of obligations that they have that they're also trying to meet. We need to also make what we're doing relevant. So, you know, examples where I was talking earlier about micro-credentials, stackable credentials, opportunities for mature students to continue to work, but something that they can do that is asynchronous, you know, at a time when it suits them, and allows them to be able to access and do small bite-sized chunks of credits which they can stack up to something that might end up as a master's program, a master's qualification or an undergraduate qualification, or it may not. Yeah, and I think that's the other thing, is people understanding that universities are not just simply about undergraduate and postgraduate qualifications. They're much broader than that.
You talked actually earlier about the need for the university to engage with schools. So at the mature student end, how do you see that engagement possibly happening?
Well, one of the things, of course, when you said that, I immediately thought about teacher education, actually. And I was thinking about the way in which it's so important for our teachers and educators these days in schools to have the opportunity for continuous professional development that's both relevant but also is really helping them to be able to manage the changing demographic and the changing expectations of students that they're dealing with. That would be one example.
I'm going to move to our next question. Dawn, knowing you have a background in mental health, how can Auckland University influence the mental health issues here in New Zealand?
Very good question, and I think as somebody who has a mental health background, and with the position I have, it provides an opportunity to really speak to that agenda as often and with as much influence as I possibly can, because not simply are we dealing with, because we're dealing with actually a big shift in mental health issues, and some of that is because, of course, we're much more able to talk about them, but also because we're experiencing a very significant anxiety pandemic, I would describe it. But also because as universities think about this, you know, however big we are, whether we have 40,000 students or 20,000 students or 5,000 students, these are all people whose minds and whose, you know, activities are part of our daily work, and we need to think about how we support them, how we help them to grow into resilient people, resilient citizens, how they understand their responsibility as citizens to each other, and facilitating that in the university is both an internal role that we have and one that I need to be leading, but also role modelling for external environments, so that, you know, our students do feel that pastoral care and the support that they're getting is really helping them to navigate their way through their studies in a way that prepares them for life. And that's something I think we should offer to society.
So do you see at a personal level that one of your key roles will be to be a very visible advocate for mental health research and mental health services?
Absolutely, and that's why I talk openly about coming from the family background that I've come from. Also, I will say to people, you know, mental illness is a continuum and we're all on it. It's just the degree to which it's impacting us and the degree to which it informs and influences our lives and the degree to which it interferes with us to achieve all that we're capable of.
Our next question, an important one. How do you propose to manage the deep financial hole the University of Auckland currently finds itself in?
So, this is really very topical at the moment, of course, because it's an issue for universities worldwide, some of it relating to the business model. I will go back to the strategy and the business recovery comments I made earlier. So, fortunately, for the university, we are in the position of being at the front end of developing a new strategy and making decisions about where we will invest and what we will disinvest in, and also in terms of business recovery, identifying where we have opportunities. And so growing revenue, of course, is one angle of that, but there are also other things we need to do. We need to think about ways in which we can be more efficient and effective. And we may also need to think about what we have to contract in. And that actually is what good, in terms of our business, and we are also a business as well as a social enterprise, it's what we have to balance up always. It's just that it's much more acute now post-COVID.
This may well be our last, Dawn. I'm just keeping an eye on the clock, but given the current environment, how important is it to compete on an international stage? Should we be focusing on New Zealand?
Well, whatever the environment, we need to make sure that we are absolutely addressing our communities, both in New Zealand and in Auckland and in our region. But we should also have an eye to what's happening internationally, because we are not only influenced by that, we also influence that. And this is as much about making sure that there is that flow. We are a knowledge organisation, and it's really important that we think of ourselves as such, because we share that knowledge, we use that knowledge to improve lives. We do that and we get it tested out, and people check themselves against it internationally, and that informs our thinking, advances our thinking, critiques our thinking more. So we have to make sure that we are both in and outside of that environment, both external and internal, in order to really understand and keep moving in a way that informs society. We are both invented by society and we invent it. So important to have that connection.
I'm going to sneak one final question in, and it is staying with the idea of staying close to home. Kia ora, Dawn. It is great to hear how open and willing you are to learning more about Te Ao Māori. I'm interested to hear about what steps you are actively taking to increase your knowledge and awareness.
Well, so I'm fresh from the university's Runanga today. Excellent. And it was a delightful meeting and experience, and it was wonderful to have the hui there with the Runanga. So I'm working very closely with my Vice-Chancellor Maori, but also regularly working on cultural education. In fact, I had a lovely hikoi recently to learn some of the local environmental history, and doing as much as I can to immerse myself in that. And actually one of the things that's on the agenda is engaging a meeting with the iwi and hapu. So a lot happening in that regard, and it's an absolute pleasure.
And Dawn, I think that provides an excellent point for our conclusion to this conversation. Thank you so much for your openness and your readiness to share about your experiences this evening. And to those of you who have tuned in as well, we'd like to thank you for your presence and for your appreciation of our session. If you want to view this session again or share it with anyone else, you can find it on the Alumni website. But in the meantime, thank you and good evening. Good evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.